Okay, good morning.
Good morning.
Oh, good morning. Okay, sorry for my camera. Let me fix this. Why it's not reading my camera.
Rabbi, thank you for the link.
What?
Thank you for the link.
Sure, my pleasure. Welcome. I'm just trying to figure out my camera because
I
I,
see you.
yeah, but I have a better camera here. And for some reason, it's plugged in, it's not coming up.
Hard to pair these things.
Um, there it is. Okay, makes sense. Here we go.
Do any, do any of you have something that says floating reactions?
No,
No, that's very odd.
just reactions.
Morning.
Good morning. It floats when you press on a reaction. It floats up to your picture.
Oh,
Yeah, it's not a big deal.
thank you. Mine came on automatically. It was like divine presence. I I had my website with King of the Field. It was on, and I
Yeah,
did not touch anything from last night. Late
yeah,
last night. It just came on.
yeah. That's no big deal.
I
Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to share my screen and here we go. Okay. Um, let's see if I could see you guys. Um, okay. So we're going to begin to introduce this concept with a quick video from Jem. Various different encounters with the Rebbe regarding this idea of the king in the field, and then I'll go into talking about what exactly it is. So enjoy. Let me know that you could see it properly and you can hear it.
Ganz Chedisch Elul, unhebendig von Risch Chedisch Elul, ist auch wie der alte Rebbe gesagt, ist das Dämmelt der Zeit, bedugma, wie ein Meller Bosser Vadam, wie ein Kaiser Dolle Mato, geht er reis, gefindt sich nicht in sein Stadt, weil gefindt sich im Feld, und der
I think your head is blocking
guckt
the words on the screen,
zu sehen, nach
Levi.
allem zusammen, mit der schmeicheldicken Panne und mit der freilichen Panne und hat sie lieb und wart und wie sie gerät, aber sollen sich zu ihm wenden und ihm begrüßen und beten bei ihm, bei Kosches, wie man bet bei einem Melech, in welchen Sachen benötigt sich. Is gerät auf zu erfüllen, oder die Bakosche wie mir erfüllt, a Bakosche mit a friedlichen Ponnen und mit a schmeicheldicken Ponnen, was sie gewendet zu dem, was betterte die Bakosche und alle Arunike.
The Rebbe always spoke about the month of Elul, the Melech Basada. Everybody could go to the king and ask for whatever they want. It's a very special time. So I wrote to the Rebbe, whatever was on my heart, that I'm going through a very difficult time, and we are coming to this month that the king is in the field. However, since I do not know how to approach the king, I'm asking the Rebbe to please intercede on my behalf. And the Rebbe was very upset with me. And where I wrote, I do not know how to approach the king, he underlined it twice and wrote question mark, exclamation point, and wrote, they teach this already in kindergarten. As if to say, why am I saying I don't know how to approach the king in the field if they tell kindergarten children that the king is in the field and everybody can approach him?
Zu gehen Teilas Emes und sagt jedem von euch, als ihr sollt wissen sein, als der Aze Jidos bepeil Mamosh, afal pi was me seht das nicht mit fleischige Augen, riecht das nicht an im Ganzen nicht, die Mitzis von der Sache und die Starkheit von der Sache, aber das verkehrt, dass noch stärker und peilt noch mehr Ruhe, wie sagt, was me seht das mit eine Bossor.
I had another story with my health. I was once in the hospital with a back problem, and I was quite upset about it. And I wrote to the Rebbe. I wrote the date, which was one of the early days of Elul. Elul Shahamelech Basada, that the king is in the field. And the Rebbe added to the king is in the field, V'gam b'beit harefua Cornell, sheba hi nimtzeis.
When I was 12 years old, I had the schus to go into Yechidus to the Rebbe. The Rebbe asked me if I learned about the parable of the king in the field. I answered yes. So the Rebbe asked me, did you ever meet the king in the field? And I was a little dumbfounded, so I did not answer. So the Rebbe gave me the answer and said, you should know that whenever you say, blessed be Hashem, you are now meeting with the king in the field.
Beschauß mit kommen zu gehen zu Kinder und mit zu sagen, der Melech von Seir Medine wird gefunden im Feld und dort hat jeder die Möglichkeit auf Zugehen zu ihm und bekommen von ihm ein Schmeichel und eine Gelegenheit abzustellen, der Melech die Bakosch und wird sie erfüllen, ist doch verstandig, als jeder Kind ist nicht nur, wird das tun, sondern wird das tun mit der größten Simche.
It was a month of Elul, and times were really, really hard at that moment, I remember. I wrote a letter to the Rebbe, a very depressed letter. And basically, the Rebbe answered, Harei Hamelech Basadeh, just ask him, just ask him.
ימים קשים אלה, הברכה של הרב תשמע לנו במיוחד.
איזה ימים קשים זה ימים ערב חידוש אבל. חידוש אבל, הנה רבינו הזוקין, בבא תמי, שאז המלך, מלך מלך המלוך, ניסו בסדר, זאת אומרת קרוב לכל אחד ואחד, לבני ישראל בכלל, והיו הנמצאים בארץ הקודש במיוחד.
The Chassidim in Israel chartered a whole plane to come to the Rebbe. My father was in Elul in New York because he used to come for Chafav for the Rebbe's father's yahrzeit. And he's standing outside 770 waiting for the taxi to take him to the airport to go back to Milan for Tishrei, for the holidays. And he is down. Here is a charter coming to the Rebbe for Yom Tov, and he is going back to Italy, to his shul. And one of the Rebbe's secretaries, Reb Moshe Leibrochstein, he sees my father. He tells my father in Yiddish, what are you so down? What happened? He goes into 770. About 3 minutes later, he comes out, tells the father, go in. Just like that, in the middle of the day, go into the Rebbe. And the Rebbe said, no, Es ist doch Chedesh Elul. Es ist doch Melech Basada, the king is in the field. The Rebbe went with his hands. Umar eponim shoicha kois lekulam. He shows a smiling face to everybody. And the Rebbe with a smile. Then he tells my father, Fargesundheit. Have a safe trip.
The Rebbe wanted to bring about that point that meeting the Melech Basada and connecting with Hashem, there isn't something that's such that you have to reach a high level. It's not Leiba Shemayim. It's very much within reach.
Verlos alle deine Sachen, und du hast eine spezielle Gelegenheit, nicht wie unter dem chedischen Jahr, abtreffen sich Ponym mit dem Melech. Und sehen und reden mit ihm und bekommen von ihm, als wo du verlangst.
So I was thinking, yeah, it's true. God is in the field, God is with us. And I just started to speak to him every single day. And it did change my whole aspect. Instead of looking at that I'm alone in this and I'm miserable and it's hard, I just started speaking to my Father in heaven and say, Hashem, you're here. You know, I'm asking you for this. And it did lighten my load. I didn't feel alone in my struggle, which really did help.
Okay. Very nice. Okay. So we're back over here, and we a little bit jumped the gun because we saw how Elul has an effect physically and how the king is in the field, and you could go over to ask him questions. And the question is, where does this whole concept come from? What does it mean the king is in the field? And what is this all about? So over here on this slide, I have the actual original wording, or a translation of the original wording from the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, the composer, the writer of the Tanya, which we started a class on Monday. And over here, he goes on to talk about the month of Elul. And he tells us how Elul is the Hebrew words, Ani L'Dodi V'Dodi Li, Aleph, Lamed, Vav, Lamed. Those are the four letters which spell out the month of Elul. And they stand for the verse, An L'Dodi V'Dodi Li, which means, I am to my beloved, and my beloved is to me. And he goes on to explain that the idea is that we have Elul, which is I am to my beloved, and then we have Tishrei, which is the high holidays, which is my beloved is to me. In Elul, we initiate the relationship. God is not initiating it. And then after our initiation, during Elul, God reciprocates during the high holidays. Let's see this inside, where he will introduce to us the concept of the king is in the field. So I'm reading over here on the screen. The first letters of the words of the verse, Shir Hashirim, I am my beloved, and my beloved is mine, spell out the name Elul. The spiritual service beginning in Elul is that of I am my beloved's, i.e. an arousal from below, an initiative taken by the Jewish people to draw closer to God. Although the divine service of Elul is to be initiated by man, there is also a revelation of godliness at this time which inspires that arousal. Thus, it is known that Elul is a time when certain attributes of mercy are revealed. Okay, so here we have the initial concept where he's going to go into the idea of the king in the field. He tells us that although Elul is a time of our initiation, it's our arousal, it's us coming to God, not God initiating, not God inspiring. Nevertheless, there is a special revelation that's happening in this month. Now, the obvious question is, how could we say that there's a revelation when we just said that the point of Elul is that it's our initiation, that it's our work? Seemingly a revelation from above means that God's initiating, that God's arousing. And the answer is that in life, there's a difference between an opportunity and an inspiration, right? So sometimes we could be inspired, there could be an aroma, there could be an atmosphere which draws us in. And then other times there isn't that atmosphere, perhaps it's missing. But what there is the opportunity. And the concept of the king in the field, or so far what he said over here, is the concept of the revelation of the 13 attributes of mercy is not the inspiration, but the opportunity. On Rosh Hashanah, on Yom Kippur, we have a revelation from God which is there to inspire us, which is there to kind of take us over, that we lose ourselves within this atmosphere, within this holiness, and we ride that wave. During the days of Elul, we're not going to feel this inspiration from above. But if we do tap in to what's going on, we are told that there are special energies out there. There's a special presence of God out there during this month particularly, namely the 13 attributes of mercy, which is the divine will of God. And that is more available than ever before during the rest of the year, which makes Elul the opportunity that we should be aroused, that we should turn to God, right? So if you're following me with these two concepts, again, Tishrei is the idea of an arousal from above. God's inspiring us, He's taking us in. You come to shul whether you like it or not. You come to shul whether you've been doing that the whole year or not. Elul is a time where no one is going to get inspired unless they inspire themselves. But it's an opportunity to be inspired because God's available. God's available. Just walk over to Him and talk to Him, and He is there to listen to you. So regarding this, the Alter Rebbe went and told us the parable of Melech Basada, of the king in the field. He said the idea of the revelation of the 13 attributes of mercy is like a king coming to the field. Now, what's the concept of a king coming to the field? You have a paradox here. You have two opposite things going on. On the one hand, the king is coming without his glory. He doesn't have all his ministers. He's not wearing his crown. He's wearing regular clothing. You could almost miss him. You could not realize that the king is in the field. When you go to the palace and you're walking in the greatness of the king, then automatically you're going to be taken over by the awesomeness of that king. You're going to be full of awe, full of love, full of connection. You're going to want to talk to the king because you see the greatness of the king. In the field, the king's greatness is not visible. On the other hand, only over here is he actually available. Because if you're going to go to the palace, they're not going to let you in. If you're going to go to the palace, you're going to have to get special permission. And even there, you're going to have a very limited amount of time. While over here, when the king is walking in the field, he seems to just be available. So we have this paradox. We have the opportunity of the king being in the field. Yet at the same time, it's not an arousal because the king is almost camouflaged. He's wearing ordinary clothing. You can miss that he's the king. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide here. And this brings me to the paradox of Elul, and this is where the Alter Rebbe's question comes in, which is, why is Elul not a holiday? If it's true that Elul has this inspiration, Elul has this revelation of the 13 attributes of mercy, then why should it not be considered a holiday? So I want to just explain this question for a moment. What indeed is the difference between a holiday and the rest of the year? What makes Sabbath holier? What makes a holiday special? Can anyone give me some insight in terms of the Kabbalah or the energies that are going on? What makes a holiday a different day than the rest of the year?
Does it have anything to do with the moon?
So the dates obviously are connected to the lunar calendar, correct?
Yeah.
So we have, well, Shabbos is more connected to just every seventh day. And then we have the lunar calendar, which are going to dictate what days of the year are holidays. My question is, what makes a holiday special, or why do we have certain customs or laws, restrictions during a holiday? Or let me start with that. What are the restrictions? What sets apart a holiday practically in Jewish law from any other day of the year?
Some are designated by God. And I guess what sets them apart is that we don't do our usual activities.
Exactly. So we're not allowed to work, right? So that's the basic concept of a holiday, that we don't work during a holiday. Why? So you mentioned, David, about God sets it apart. Kabbalah teaches us that in terms of God's relationship to the world, we have two types of relationships. We have a natural relationship, and then we have I will just loosely use the term a miraculous relationship, right? So the difference between a natural relationship versus a miraculous relationship is a natural relationship. God is working on the world's terms. Okay? God is approaching our world and relating to our world on our terms. A miraculous relationship would be the other way around, where God's relationship to the world is on his terms, right? So generally speaking, the sea of reeds just flows naturally. Who's making it flow? God is making it flow. But God is relating to that sea on its terms, on the sea's terms. When God chooses to split the sea, God is still relating to that sea, but now he's relating to that sea on his own terms. So those are generally two relationships of God to this world. Now, on a holiday, God approaches the world on his terms, so to speak, which is why we are expected to be less human, less regular, less natural during that day. And the same thing is true with Shabbos. Again, there's a lot of details, and every day will be a little slightly different. But the general concept is that on a weekday, we are commanded to work. We are commanded to deal with the world. Why? Because God's relationship to the world on this day is that of a natural relationship. It's on the world's terms. On a holiday, there's an extra revelation where God is less confined, God is less contracted, and God's relation to the world is more of himself. He is present as himself, and therefore we are commanded to be more like God, right? So we'll have a regular holiday where we're not allowed to do work. We'll have Yom Kippur, which we're not supposed to even eat, because we're expected to be living on a higher plane. We're expected to be experiencing, or at least allowing us to tap in to that energy which is a little bit beyond this world. And that's why the Alter Rebbe's question comes in: why is Elul not a holiday if Elul has this revelation of the 13 attributes of mercy, which is also beyond this world? As a matter of fact, the 13 attributes of mercy is the very same revelation that happens on Yom Kippur. Okay, so if Yom Kippur is a holiday because there's this great revelation of the will of God, seemingly there should be that very same level of restriction and level of service during the entire 30 days of the month of Elul. That is the question of the Alter Rebbe. Are we with me? Does that question make sense?
Is Elul and its practice designated in the Torah?
No, and that's part of that would actually be part of the question, right? So what we have in the Torah is the high holidays. We have Rosh Hashanah, we have Yom Kippur, we have Sukkot, we have the other holidays telling us what to do and what not to do. And seemingly Elul doesn't have any practices. We have customs during Elul, so we blow the shofar during Elul. We say the Psalms of David Hashem Ori. The Svardim will say Slichas the entire Elul, special prayers in the beginning of every morning. Traditionally, Elul was always a very serious time, and a time of taking accounting, and a time of, kind of evaluating your year and hoping that God is going to give you a good year coming in the new year, Rosh Hashanah. But here, the Alter Rebbe is introducing us. The Alter Rebbe is a great Kabbalist. The Alter Rebbe was a genius, a Torah scholar, and someone who had insights in what goes on. And the Alter Rebbe said, Elul is not another month. Elul is not a regular month. Indeed, Elul is a month of joy, and Elul is a month of special connection. Why? Because the king is in the field, because there's this great revelation from God that happens during Elul. But this begs the question: if indeed there's such a revelation from God, then why isn't it not mentioned in the Torah? Why isn't it not a mitzvah? Why isn't there restriction during this month? And by understanding the answer to this question, we're actually going to come to understand the real depth of what Elul is all about. Any other questions before we continue?
I always tend to look at things a little differently. And I guess the one thing I respect most about the Rebbe's, as I've learned about them, is their amazing insight into human nature. And to the concept of creating this month and signifying its importance, kind of to prepare you for the high holidays, which are designated by God, seemed like a brilliant tactic to help people do what they need to do for the upcoming soul search.
Okay, I definitely appreciate your honesty. Um, so I'm going to say two things. Number one is even before the Alter Rebbe came around, Elul was always a special month, but it was different in terms of what the specialty was all about. Elul was always considered traditionally a time of fear, a time of we're coming, if you go to, or 100 years ago, if you walked into a regular brisker shul, you would hear people talking about how Elul is a time to realize that you're being audited. And you have 20 days to fix up your papers because they're going to come and they're going to audit you, and it's a scary time. And perhaps they would give examples of people that are being sentenced to death and the noose is coming around their neck. They would really frighten the Jewish people during this month to kind of fix up and shape up. And in general, the Rebbe's weren't a fan of that approach. But not only that, when the Rebbe told us something, the Rebbe didn't lie. I don't believe the Rebbe lied ever. And for the Rebbe to tell us that this month has a unique revelation, and he doesn't just say any revelation, he's quoting the Zohar, and he pulls out a very specific revelation which is connected to that of Yom Kippur. And we'll see that there's a lot of depth here as we continue this conversation. He's telling us the truth, I believe. And that truth is that during this month, there's a special revelation, there's a unique revelation. And the question again is, if so, why are we permitted to work during this month? Okay, so I'm going to move on to the answer, which is the king in the field. And I a little bit jumped ahead of myself. But in reality, the Alter Rebbe says the king in the field parable to answer this very question. Because again, the question is, if there's such a revelation, why is it not a holiday? And a similar question, which I asked earlier, is if Elul is about our initiation, then why is there a revelation? Or how does that revelation not contradict the concept of our initiation? And here comes the Alter Rebbe and tells us it's like a king in the field. Just like a king in the field, the king is available. The king is there. There's a certain revelation. But that revelation is more of an opportunity than an inspiration. Why? Because the king is not walking with his entourage, he's not wearing his crown, he's not wearing his kingly garments. You could be busy with your work and you could totally not notice him. And Alter Rebbe goes on and says, and not only that, but those that are in the desert are not going to see the king in the field at all. Now, what does it mean that those that are in the desert? The Alter Rebbe explains that in life, there's three areas that we could find ourselves in. We can find ourselves in the city, which the city is a place of holiness. So when we're putting on tefillin, when we're celebrating Shabbat, when we're eating kosher, those are times, or not kosher, but when we're doing specific things that are holy, have a holy atmosphere, that is the city. The field is where we grow the crop. The field is where a place where we take the mundane and turn it to make it food. That represents the space where we're serving God. We're eating kosher, we're doing the right thing, we're saying a nice word. We're in this world, we're doing our regular day-to-day life on a regular Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. We're not sitting in shul and we're not, celebrating Shabbat. We're doing our regular mundane life, but we're doing it for God. That's the field. The wilderness or the desert is a place which is not for God, where we don't do stuff for God, or we, God forbid, do something we sin, which is against God. And that would be the desert. And the message over here is that Elul is a time to come to the field. Those that are in the desert should come to the field. Because if we align our views with that of God, if we align our views to say, I want to serve God, I want to be devoted, that for the next month, I want to make sure that everything I do, or most things that I do, or some area of my life is more focused on God. Not necessarily the holiness, not going to shul, but just doing it right, doing it for God. Eating kosher, for example. that is a place to meet the king. That is a place where the king is standing there and ready to greet us. Now, what's the novelty of this concept? The novelty of this concept is that he's not in the city. Usually, where do we have that high? Where do we have that inspiration? Where do we say that this is not just serving God, but God is actually present? This is a relationship with God. So that would be in the shul, or that would be on a Shabbos, which is a day of holiness. That would be on a time where we're not our regular self. Over here, there's a special message, which is you could be your regular self. You could be in the field. You could be doing your own thing. And you could be eating and sleeping and being a regular person, regular day-to-day life. And nevertheless, there's a special message that God is present here with you. You don't see him. You don't feel that high. That's exactly why. Because he's in the field, because he's more approachable than ever. So we have these two concepts. On the one hand, it becomes a opportunity. Yet on the other hand, it's not a high. It's not an inspiration from above. And this leads me, maybe this will bring out this message a little better, to three concepts, three stages of connection. So this is my own idea, gathered from other people, but it's not from the Alter Rebbe, but it just, I think, brings out a little bit this idea of the difference between the rest of the year and then Elul, and then we have the high holidays. So in a regular parent-child relationship, you have a child and he goes to school and he has his report card and he makes trouble, and one day he's a better day, and this day he did well on his test, another day he didn't do so good on his test. And generally speaking, the relationship between the parent and the child is going to be very much based on the actions of the child. So how are you doing today? Right? How's it going? And then we have special times. So let's say there's a wedding, right? A family wedding. And at the wedding, the child is wearing his best and the family is wearing their finest. And over here at this wedding, the child is not being asked, are you a good child? The child is not being asked, did you do well on your test? The child is part of the family because here is a time to celebrate the family. The wedding is a time where the family is just so in sync and so inspired and so uplifted that no one really cares what you got on your test. So if a child would come over to his father during a wedding and say, Dad, I'm sorry that I said this and this to you the other night, Dad would say, what are you talking about? This is not a time to apologize. It's not a time to make up. You're my son. This is a family wedding. It's a family simcha. It's a time of holiness, a time of inspiration. This concept of a wedding represents the idea of the high holidays. We return to God, and God says, I don't care what you did the whole year. I don't care who you are. I don't care how you've been acting. You're a Jew. You have a soul. You're connected. You're loved. A big hug, right? And that's the concept of Shabbos. That's the concept of a holiday where, again, the relationship with God is on his terms. So no one cares at this point what our actions have been. Are we a good Jew? It's just about we're coming into God's embrace. If we come to shul, if we connect, even if we don't come to shul, God says, I don't care what you're doing. You're connected. You're mine. And that's the idea of the high holidays. That's the idea of a Shabbos versus the rest of the year where it's kind of like the report card where God is saying, are you a good Jew? Are you doing the right thing? Are you doing what you have to do? Hopefully, if he's a good parent, then he doesn't judge us, right? But nevertheless, there's a certain level of accountability based on our actions. Now, if we only had these two periods during the year, there would never be an opportunity to say, I'm sorry. There would never be an opportunity to repent. There would never be an opportunity to make up in truth. Why? Because again, during the wedding, during a Shabbos, during the holidays, that's not a time to repent because no one even knows that you sinned. There's no sin today. You're the best. You're a tzaddik. You're on the top of the world. You're connected to God. There's no place for repentance. During the rest of the year, during a regular day, there's no place for repentance either because the concept of repentance is erasing my sins. How could you erase someone's sins? You did what you did. You have to take accountability. During a regular day, we look at your report card. Today was a little better. Yesterday was a little worse. Maybe you could try to make it up, but the concept of real makeup, where we erase the past and head to a better future, that cannot exist during the regular day-to-day life. Although nothing ever stands in the way of tshuva, so someone could always repent. But in terms of the regular cycle of life, in terms of the regular relationship of God to the world and God to the Jewish people, we have these two periods, and seemingly none of them give place for repentance. And that's when Elul comes in. For this, I'm going to give an example of vacation. So a family vacation, you seem to have two opposites going on. On the one hand, it's not a time for report cards. A family vacation is a time to relax, a time to spend time with the family. Yet at the same time, you're not expected to be dressed your best. And dad is going to get on the floor and play a game with you, and he'll talk your language, and he'll ask you how you're doing. And during a family vacation is the opportune time to turn to dad and say, Dad, I'm sorry that I spoke to you that way. And dad says, I really forgive you because we're a family. So on the one hand, there isn't that revelation of I don't care who you are, it's a time which is just above and beyond. Yet at the same time, it's not the regular day-to-day life where every action is accountable. It's a time where there is a certain presence, there is a certain interest that dad is taking in us. The king is taking an interest in the people in the field. He's coming to the field and saying, the work that you're doing in this field is invaluable to me. And therefore, I'm taking a personal interest. And therefore, I don't need you to get out of your farmer clothing and travel to the city to come and meet me. Rather, I'm coming to you and meeting you in the field. Okay, does that make it any clearer what this concept is about?
Very good. Yeah.
Okay. So that is the initial idea that the Alter Rebbe introduced, the concept of the king in the field. God is here with us in our regular modernity, and that's why we are supposed to go to work. It's not a Shabbos, nothing is forbidden, and we do it our regular day in, day out, but it's a time to pause, the time to turn to God. It's a time to say, within my regular day-to-day life, God cares about me, and he's interested in me. To the point, like we saw in that video that we just watched, that the Rebbe told people, the Rebbe was even speaking to that Israeli diplomat guy, and the Rebbe said, it's not a difficult time, just turn to God. God is listening. God wants to hear you. And we'll see another very powerful video by the end, which brings out this concept. But I want to take this a step further, because in reality, there's a lot of depth to this idea, and we're not going to be able to cover everything today, but I do want to show you some of that depth. So number one, a question the Rebbe asks. The Rebbe was talking to a bunch of children, and the Rebbe is talking in the month of Elul, and he's telling them that the king is in the field, and he's talking to these children, and he says, a child needs everything to be very real, very concrete. Even most of us need things to be concrete. And you're telling me that God is in the field, God is walking on the street, and I could just turn to him and talk to him, and as long as I'm turning to him, he's listening to me, but I don't see him. Right? So how am I supposed to approach God if I don't see him? And the Rebbe in this particular talk gave a very interesting perspective to this. The Rebbe told us that the fact that we don't see him does not mean that he's not present. Right? So let's think about this for a moment. The fact that I do see someone when they are present, the fact that I take it for granted that if Anita would walk into this room or David would walk into this room, that means that I have to see them to be present. If they're present, that means I see them. If I don't see them, I assume they're not here. Is that because presence and visuality are one and the same? Or is that because we as human beings are limited to that framework?
Obviously.
Right? Obviously, it's because as human beings, we're limited to that framework. And I would give you a proof. I would tell you that there are a lot of things in your room right now, like radio waves, that you don't see because they're not limited to that framework, although they're there. And to take it a step further, I will tell you that even concepts, 2 + 2 = 4, that is also a reality within the space that you're living right now, but you don't see it. There's no way of touching it. And the Rebbe said, obviously, God we're not going to see. No one expects to see God because God is not a human being. And nevertheless, we're telling you God is present. So take it on this angle. If you would stop for a second and recognize, if any king, if the president of the United States would decide to, walk down my block without any supervision, without any guards, and I could just walk over to him and tell him my issues and tell him what I need and tell him what I want of him or tell him what I think of him, you know, um, that would be incredible. Hey, talk about a king, and not just any king, but talk about God who doesn't even have to be visible for him to be present. Recognize the greatness of that reality, that we're talking about a king that doesn't have to be visible. And on the contrary, he seemingly, on a simple level, he can't be visible. If he wanted to, he could, but on a basic level, he can't be visible. He's not in that realm. And nevertheless, he's present. He's coming to me, to be with me, to spend time with me, to allow me to talk to him and approach him. How much of a greater joy and how much of a greater connection and relationship should that demand, should that call for? Which leads me to the next question. And the question the Rebbe asks over here, which is extremely interesting, especially considering the fact that this idea of the king in the field that I showed you earlier, that discourse that I previously showed you, was written about 200 years ago. And over here, only 200 years later, is the Rebbe addressing a seemingly very simple question. So again, the Alter Rebbe asked, why is Elul not a holiday? Right? And simply speaking, the question is, why is Elul not a day where we're commanded not to do mundane activity? Just like Shabbos, we don't do mundane activity, and a Yom Tov on a holiday, we don't do mundane activity. So Elul should be a time where we're not allowed to do, we refrain from work. And the answer was because it's a time where God is with us in the field, and therefore we are working. So there is this great revelation, but nevertheless, we are allowed to do work and we're commanded to work because it's still a regular day in the sense that God is actually coming to us. The question is that there's other things that make a holiday. Can anyone else tell me what else comes to mind other than refraining from work? What else are we commanded on a holiday?
Not to strangle your siblings.
Not to strangle your siblings. Okay, so that would be any day of the year. That would be any day. So that's even a regular day where the king is not in the field. We're not supposed to strangle our siblings.
I think you have to be besimcha, no?
What?
Except for Yom Kippur, you need to be besimcha.
Very good. Even
to be besimcha.
Very good, right? So one second. So there is a commandment during every holiday to be joyous, right? And according to the explanation that we gave earlier on what a holiday is all about, there's this extra revelation of God, then we understand that joy is connected to that revelation. Why is there a special mitzvah to be joyous on a holiday? Because there's a special revelation that happens during a holiday. Now, during the month of Elul, we understand that we're not commanded to refrain from doing work because the king is in the field, God is with us in modernity, but nevertheless, there is still this great revelation. And with that said, seemingly there should be a commandment to be joyous, just like any holiday. This is the Rebbe's question. If you look at the screen, I mentioned Purim here. Can anyone guess why I mentioned Purim? How does Purim play a role in this concept that I'm talking about, where we're not commanded to refrain from work, but seemingly we should be commanded to be joyous? Can anyone share some insight on that? So Purim actually has this exact makeup, So are we all familiar with the holiday of Purim? Right? So Purim is a month before Passover, and Purim is actually considered the most joyous day of the year. And during the whole month of Adar, which is the month of Purim, we're supposed to be joyous, and particularly on Purim, Purim was the only time in Jewish tradition that you're supposed to go all out. During a regular holiday, the rabbis would send messengers from house to house to make sure that people didn't go overboard with their joy. They weren't taking too much schnapps. But during Purim, it actually says the obligation is to take so much schnapps that you don't know the difference between blessed is Mordechai and cursed is Haman. Right? So Purim is considered the most joyous time of the year. Nevertheless, on Purim, there is no obligation, there is no prohibition against working, against mundane work. Purim is a regular day on the calendar, essentially. Purim is not a day where you're not allowed to turn on the lights or you're not allowed to drive. Purim is a day where you could do any of that. And nevertheless, Purim is the most joyous day. So the Alter Rebbe actually explains in a Purim discourse, he tells us because Purim is such a great day that it rises above the difference between a holiday and the weekday. So usually God is particular. God says, don't work on a holiday because you have to be like me. You have to be on my terms. Purim is such a deep connection. It's for another time, but that's just the gist of it. Purim is such a deep connection to God that we say there is no distinction between a holiday and a work day, and you're allowed to work on the day of Purim. Nevertheless, the joy is is boundless. The joy is incredible. And that brings out this question that Elul seems to be very similar to Purim in that sense. Elul seems to be a day which is essentially a holiday, but nevertheless we work. So why is there no joy? If anything, the joy should be even greater than that of Purim. And the Rebbe actually will explain to us that indeed it is. The fact that we're not commanded to have joy in Elul is because the joy of Elul is greater than the joy of Purim. But to get to that, we're going to have to go on a little detour. Okay, so I'm going to have to, so we understand where we're going over here. So we're trying to get to the place to recognize what the joy of Elul is all about and why we're not commanded to have joy during Elul. But in order to get there, we're going to have to talk about something else, which I think is also very interesting. So this brings me to the concept of education. Education is a very interesting thing, which is we know that everyone is obligated to educate their children. If we have children, or even if we have a student, which is like a child, we're obligated to educate them in Torah and in mitzvot. However, something which is interesting is that there is actually no mitzvah to educate your children. Education seems to be something which is just a given. There is no mitzvah in the Torah, there's no commandment to educate your children. The question is why? Seemingly there's so many commandments, everything is a commandment. Why is there no commandment to educate your children? So the Rebbe actually suggests initially that education is like any preparatory mitzvah, right? So let's say, for example, there's a mitzvah to light Shabbos candles. Well, is it a mitzvah to set up your Shabbos candles? Right? And the answer is no. There's no mitzvah to set up your Shabbos candles. There's a mitzvah to put on tefillin? Is there a mitzvah to prepare tefillin? There's no mitzvah to prepare tefillin because obviously, if you're supposed to put it on, you have to prepare it. So it seems like any preparatory mitzvah is a given, right? If you have to, there's a mitzvah to give a bris or to slaughter an animal. But is there a mitzvah to prepare the knife? No, there's no mitzvah to prepare the knife because that seems to be a given. Bia, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, you sound like a Jewish mother. They expect it, right? Why should I have to say it? I expect it.
Exactly. It seems to be a given. And therefore, the Rebbe wants to say maybe education is the same concept. If you're going to be obligated at the age of 12 or 13 in all the mitzvahs, then obviously you have to educate. And that should be considered a preparatory thing. That's not considered a mitzvah. But the Rebbe doesn't accept that. The Rebbe says the difference between education and all those other things is because when it comes to lighting Shabbos candles is holy. Lighting Shabbos candles is the will of God. Preparing Shabbos candles is not holy. There's nothing holy about that. You know, when putting on tefillin is holy, but preparing tefillin is not holy. Slaughtering an animal is holy, but preparing the knife is not holy. But educating a child is holy. Not only is it holy, but sometimes we'll say that the education of a child, the mitzvah of a child, is even greater than that of the mitzvah of an adult, right? We know that God gave us the Torah, and he said that he wants a guarantor. And who are the guarantors for the Torah? He didn't accept Moses, he didn't accept the elders, he didn't accept all the Jewish people. He said the children are going to be the guarantor. There's something special about the mitzvot of a child, the sincerity, the purity of a child, that in a way supersedes the mitzvah of an adult. And therefore, the question returns, why is education not considered a commandment? Now, obviously, we can't command a child because the child is premature. The concept of a bar and bas mitzvah is the concept that now you're old enough to be commanded to do something, to be expected to do something. So the child is not going to be commanded. But the question is that the adult should be commanded, right? The parent should be commanded, or the caretaker should be commanded. The commandment, the obligation should lie on the educator. But there is no obligation to educate. And here comes the question, why? And here the Rebbe goes into a phenomenal concept of what education is about, which is a idea that the Rebbe brings out often. What the Rebbe believes, the power of education and what education really is all about, which will lead us to a three-step process. So over here, you can see on the screen, it says education is beyond commandment. And I don't know why I have these boxes on the screen. But basically the concept is that it's a given that, you know, there's a discussion in the sages, is believing in God a commandment? And this is a conversation, it's a discussion, but the reason why it wouldn't be a commandment is because if you don't believe in God, then who's commanding you? Right? A basic premise to any commandment is that God exists. I can't be commanded to believe in God. Obviously, I believe in God if I believe in the commandment. Right? So there's a certain premise that exists before we begin a commandment. Rabbi says that the same is true with education. There is a concept of accepting the yoke of God, or, you know, being subservient. God is my leader, God is my head, God is my ruler, and I'm going to listen. And that concept of God being my head, God being my leader, it is a commandment, but it seems to be a little bit more of a commandment. Maybe it's a more fundamental commandment to accept God, right? Now, when it comes to education, what's education all about? And here's where the Rebbe introduces the power of education. Only today, I believe, you know, the modern world is coming around to recognize the power of education and the power of educating a child even before they're able to talk. This is something that Torah spoke about from the very beginning, the power of, you know, saying words of Torah to the infant while they're still in the womb. That's going to affect their upbringing, or talking to the child, washing their hands when they wake up in the morning, this little baby, because that's going to affect their upbringing. The little things that we do with the little tiniest child is going to affect them. And the question is why? And I have an uncle, Yossi Paltiel, Rabbi Yossi Paltiel, who is a great scholar, and he says that why is it that babies have no recollection of their youth, right? Why is it for the first year or two of our lives, we barely have any recollection? So he says that he believes the reason is because our experiences as a baby are so part of us that we identify with them. We don't recognize them as a memory. Memories have the ability to separate the memory from us. But as a baby, we identify with those memories that we don't have them as a memory. They are part of who we are. They're part of our makeup. So take that or leave that. The point is the same, which is as a child, what we give a child becomes the imprint in that child's life. It becomes part of who they are. And the concept of education is giving to the child an identity. We're not trying to teach them how to do something. We're not trying to teach them how to act a certain way. Rather, education is about giving them an identity. And in Torah, if we're talking about a Torah education, it's about showing them who their identity really is. Because we know as a Jew, we are a Jew inside. If I'm able to give that education to my child, that means that I'm giving to my child the ability to identify with Judaism, to realize that they are a Jew. They don't do Jew, they don't act Jew, rather they are a Jew inside. That's who they are. And if it's about identity, there's no place to command it. If we're going to command, that's exactly the opposite of education, because commandment is there's me and then I'm commanded to do something. But the whole concept of education is if I identify with it, if it's about who I am, I'm not subservient to something, I'm not serving someone. Rather, that's who I am inside, that's my identity, that's my entire being, that I'm not commanded to do it, that's who I am. And this leads us to recognize the concept of Elul and how Elul leads into the rest of the year. So coming into the month of Tishrei, which is the month of the high holidays, we know from Jewish tradition that high holidays is about accepting the yoke of heaven. The high holidays is about reaffirming my commitment to God, telling God I'm ready for the rest of the year to serve you. And then the rest of the year is about serving him. Comes Elul, and Elul is the stage of education. Before I accept that yoke, I have to identify. And identify doesn't come with any glamour. Identify doesn't come with any great revelation. Identity doesn't come with any inspiration from the outside. Identity has to come from within. Identity, like education, is a time where I pause and I recognize that I'm a Jew inside. Not because I'm inspired, not because there's any fireworks, not because there's any great revelation, but because that's who I am inside. That's my identity. And this brings us to the three stages, which just show us the incredible perfection of Judaism. We always thought Tishrei was the first month of the year, but in a sense, Elul is the first month of the year because we begin the year, or we finish the year, this month of Elul, by recognizing that being a Jew, being a Yid is who I am inside. That's my education, that's my identity, which leads me to the month of Tishrei, which allows me to turn to God and say, because that's who I am inside, I'm ready to accept the yoke of heaven. I'm ready to do what you need from me. And then going into the rest of the year, of Cheshvan, Kislev, Teves, the rest of the next 11 months of the year, doing what I need to do with that acceptance and with that inspiration. So every year we have a miniature full lifetime, right? Just like in a lifetime, we have that period of being a child where we're educated as a Jew. And then there is the period of Bar and Bas Mitzvah, we accept the yoke of heaven. We take it upon ourselves. And then there's the rest of our life where we're supposed to do the right thing. We have a miniature of that every single year. We revisit that cycle of the education, the acceptance, and then the action. Okay, we're almost done. I'm going to, first of all, pause for some questions because that was a long piece. And then I'm going to finish off with my last thought about this idea. Any questions? Well, welcome, Justine. Okay, so I think we're good. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next slide. And this is also a very interesting concept, which is essentially, if you revisit the mashal, if you revisit the parable of the king in the field, you end up with a very funny phenomenon. the message of the king in the field is that when the king is in the palace, it's very hard to approach him. And you can't just go over and ask him for all your needs because it's a holy time and he's in a holy space and there's guards and everything is limited and you have to be your best self, etc., etc. However, when the king comes to the field, he's available. You could ask him whatever you want. You could talk to him. You could do, you could approach him. And the question is, how does that fit with real life when we say that during a holiday, God is in the palace? And in Elul, when we're not obligated in any special things, God is available. So you're telling me that God is available more when I'm eating my breakfast this morning than when I'm in Shul on Yom Kippur. Does that make sense? Right? How does that fit? How does that make sense? How does that align with everything that we know? To tell me that God is, in a sense, more available in when I'm going to eat lunch this afternoon than when I go to Shul on Yom Kippur. And the answer is, as we know, that the reason is because God is more available, in a sense, by lunchtime today than on Yom Kippur. Why? Because the purpose of creation is to make a dwelling place for God in this world. And when I'm fasting and I'm in shul and I'm not being myself, and there's a high, and essentially it's an initiation from God, right? Because the reason why we come to shul is because there's something tingling in our soul. There's something which is tickling our neshama. So essentially, it's an escape from ourselves. That's not a time where we're doing the ultimate purpose of bringing God into this world. It's a necessary thing. It's a necessary step to do the purpose of creation. But essentially, the purpose of creation is to bring God into this world. And if I sit down today by lunch and I make sure the food that I'm eating is kosher and I make a blessing on that food and I eat it in order to serve God, that is the ultimate purpose of creation. That is bringing God into my life. That is bringing God into this world. And in that sense, I'm approaching God face to face even more than Yom Kippur. And I think the takeaway is very clear. The takeaway is very powerful that, Yom Kippur is a great time. Yom Kippur is a time, and any holiday is a time where it's a time to be inspired. And that inspiration is necessary. And maybe we'll have another class about why that's indeed necessary. But that inspiration is definitely necessary to be a live Jew and to feel Jewish and to bring that Judaism into every facet of my life. But where is the ultimate purpose? The ultimate purpose is not to connect to God on Yom Kippur. The ultimate purpose is to connect to God in the field, to connect to God in regular day-to-day life. And that's where ultimately we could truly approach God and ask Him for whatever we need. So with that, I'm going to show you one last video, which just blew me away. I saw this video a few days ago and I said, I have to show it. It's a wild story where I think it just will bring home this concept of God really being present with us in the field during this time. So enjoy.
Yaakov
Sorry?
Abrams is a business appraiser and author on business evaluation, living in Los Angeles, California. He was married to his wife Hannah in the mid-1980s.
My wife became very sick. She was sick, pregnant. She couldn't walk. There was no life in her. If she was awake, she was nauseous. She held down almost nothing. The doctors came on a Wednesday afternoon, and these were doctors from the firm that was supplying the intravenous to us. And they said that up till now, the baby's been doing okay at your expense, but even now it's starting to become dangerous for the baby. So we have scheduled you for surgery tomorrow at 2:30 in the afternoon. and we're going to implant semi-permanent feed tubes into you and drip total parenteral nutrition into your veins, bypassing your stomach, and hopefully that will nourish you and the baby and you'll be fine. They said if that doesn't work, then they said you're going to need an abortion because you're not going to make it through this pregnancy. So that was pretty heavy. I told her, okay, let's just expect surgery tomorrow at 2:30. I called our rabbi, who was not there, and I spoke to his wife, Rebbe Simchana Boaz, and she hammered at me. Now, again, I was not a Lubavitcher. She said, you must call the Rebbe. Absolutely, you're going to call the Rebbe. Promise me you're going to call the Rebbe. Okay, I promise. I'll call the Rebbe. I figured that it was too late to call that night, so I started calling at 6 in the morning, never getting through. And finally, I spoke with Rabbi Label Groner and told him exactly what was going on, how serious my wife's condition was. And he said, and that she was scheduled for surgery at 2:30 in the afternoon, our time, and this is 10:30 in the morning, so it's just 4 hours before her scheduled surgery. He said he would go to the Rebbe immediately to ask him for a bracha. And that was the end of the conversation. I went back to my work, and almost about an hour and a quarter later, at 10 minutes to 12, I noticed the clock, and I said, oh, okay, time to go home for lunch. Now, at that time in our lives, it was going home, finding my wife in such pain and suffering. It wasn't much fun, so I called at 10 minutes to 12. And this female voice answers the phone, hello, like normal, and I was in shock. And I knew it was Hannah, but I couldn't believe it was her. So I said, Hannah, is that you? She said, yes. And I said, you're better. And she said, yeah, it's amazing. I got up and I went to the kitchen and I made Carnation instant breakfast and I held it down. I said, I'm coming home right away. I was so stunned. I drove on a surface street on Governor Drive in San Diego. I drove 80 miles an hour and I was home in 5 minutes in what was normally a 10 to 12 minute drive. I was astonished. This woman who had no life, no will to live, couldn't move. That night, she and I went out shopping together as if nothing had ever happened in between. It was just stunning. So before that, we called up the doctors and said, I think we're going to cancel the surgery. She's all of a sudden fine. And they said okay, but they seemed astonished themselves. The next day, we got a call from Rabbi Groner, who told us that the Rebbe had a message for us, and that is that it's Elul and the king is in the fields. The king was really in the fields, and our son was born on Kaf Daled Adar, 1980.
Okay, so that's the end of that story, which really blew me away. I think like also, I don't know if just to give you some background, it was interesting how the Rebbe didn't respond to him right away. And in reality, if anyone knew Chabad history a little bit, that in general, Elul, the Rebbe would respond less because the Rebbe was very preoccupied getting ready for Tishrei. But specifically that year, there was a lot going on in Chabad, and the Rebbe was very not responsive in general. And the Rebbe didn't come back giving a blessing, but the next day, the Rebbe sent back a message saying the king is in the field. And it seemed to be that message was given after the fact, which I think the takeaway for us is just very, very real and very practical. So as much as we spoke about before, the inspiration aspect of it, the concept that it's a time to connect to God, it's a time to turn to God and identify as a Jew, realize that I'm a Jew inside. Yet at the same time, at a very practical and simple level, it's a time to ask for whatever we need. Sometimes in Yom Kippur, to ask for simple, basic physical needs could seem below the grade of the day, could seem a little bit too mundane. But today it's definitely not. Today, during Elul, it's not too mundane. It's a time to turn to God, just take a moment and recognize that God is with me right here, right next to me, and interested in me, and to say, this is what I need, this and this. I'm asking for this and this, and the King is in the field, so he'll definitely answer us.
Well, thank you. That's beautiful. Thank you, Rabbi.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Any questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you. I wish.
All the best. Have a great week.
Thank you so much.